Hi, everybody. Good evening. My name is Holly Kernan. I'm the Chief Content Officer here at KQED, and we are thrilled to welcome you and our partners at the Asian American Journalists Association to the Commons tonight for Hella Asian. Yeah. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, KQED is Northern California's PBS and NPR station, and KQED Live is our new multi-platform events program that produces screenings and talks and performances and food tastings, like the deliciousness that we just had out there, based on KQED's mission to inform, inspire, and involve our communities. And you can learn more at kqed.org/live. And we want to thank this season's sponsors that make KQED Live possible: Asian Art Museum, Berkeley Rep, Comcast Business, and Oakland International Airport. Yes, please, give it up. We are so grateful for their commitment to supporting our mission of civic and cultural engagement in the Bay Area, which is why we are here. Okay, so the Asian Art Museum has a giveaway for free tickets to the lucky randomly selected members of the audience tonight to see the new exhibit Carlos Villa, Worlds in Collision, which celebrates the exuberant work and influence of the San Francisco teacher, curator, activist, and community organizer Carlos Villa. So the lucky winners are Jeff Wang, Kristen Black, and Lisa Tran. So just raise your hand, and a member of our team is going to bring you your tickets to your seat. So just keep your hand up until you get your tickets. During the pre-show, many of you also participated in our mobile trivia game about some of the startling facts about college admissions here in California, supported by our sponsors at Comcast Business. And so the top scorer here in the house tonight gets to take home a stylish KQED notebook. Oh yeah, oh yeah. The winner is Trish Pham. Trish, raise your hand. You're going to get your stylish KQED notebook. And now it is my truly great pleasure to welcome your host for the evening. She is the president of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association. She's also a former colleague of ours here at KQED, and she's currently the co-host, in fact, award-winning, just got the award that she got tonight, and she's currently the co-host and producer of the podcast Fifth and Mission. Please welcome Cecilia Lay to the stage. Yeah!
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Hella Asian. I can't explain how momentous this moment feels. It's taken so much to get here. Can we just do a round of applause for just being here? And when I say that it's taken a lot to get here, I don't just mean the months of planning, the 2-year pandemic hiatus, or all the sleepless nights wondering if will people show up. And the answer is yes. We sold out tonight, and I can't think of a better comeback. So thank you so much for being a part of the 3rd annual Hella Asian. I understand what it means these days to get up, put on some real pants, make a commute, and be social. As Holly mentioned, I host and produce San Francisco Chronicle's daily news podcast, Fifth and Mission, and that means I spend almost all my time inside my bedroom closet. So that's my home studio. So this is a lot for me, so bear with me. I want to start by just giving a quick backstory about AAJA and Hella Asian. The Asian American Journalists Association is a membership nonprofit that started in 1981, and we just passed our 50-year anniversary. And it was first imagined as an association that would help create a welcoming space for the handful of early Asian American pioneers in journalism. And in the years since, AAJA has cultivated a community that has been instrumental in not only launching the careers of journalists like me, but also retaining people inside newsrooms. Newsrooms can be incredibly tough places to be in when you don't see your own community reflected in your colleagues. Recent years have really underscored that challenge. 2021, as you all know, kicked off with a series of terrifying events, and for the AAPI community, that included a string of really violent incidents here in the Bay Area. All of a sudden, the community was in a spotlight in a way that, at least for me, I've never seen before. The attacks were making both local and national headlines. And why was that happening? Because Asian American journalists were in newsrooms speaking up, saying, we need to tell these stories. They were pitching stories to their editors. They were doing the emotional labor of convincing their peers that these stories mattered. And so AAJ did a number of things to help meet that moment. AAJ National issued guidance to newsrooms on how to cover these stories thoughtfully and with nuance. They even issued a pronunciation guide for the Asian victims of the horrific Atlanta shootings. It was an effort to not only be factually accurate, but to really give victims their dignity and their honor. And here in the Bay Area, our local chapter held a solidarity workshop in April 2021 to explore how reporting could encourage allyship and encourage solidarity during these really divisive times. So it's been a really complex time to be an Asian American journalist. And this kind of spotlight on our community comes with a lot of responsibility, and it's not easy. How do we make sure we amplify our voices, but also make sure that we're providing the right context to a news story, that we're connecting all the right dots, building connections instead of divisions? I was born and raised here in the Bay Area, and the AAPI community is in the very DNA of this region. And while it may feel like Asian Americans are speaking out for the first time, our hella Asian history tells us otherwise. I'm thinking of the creation of the Asian American identity in the late 60s in Berkeley, unifying different groups together in a way that they haven't before, the fight for ethnic studies at San Francisco State. There's this thread of activism, community building, and solidarity making that sometimes isn't reflected in the current news coverage when people try to explain to the rest of the world what our community is about. Newsrooms, they don't always get it right, and they're not always supportive of the coverage we want. And that's also why it's been a hard time to be an AAPI journalist. This is why tonight is so important. Your support of this event. You bought tickets to this event. It helps our chapter provide the support that's needed to ensure newsroom diversity and to build programming, grants, and resources to hold critical space for AAPI journalists to feel seen. And critical space is exactly what this Hella Asian stage is about. This is what's going to happen tonight. AAPI journalists and storytellers are going to come on the stage and share stories in a way that they don't normally do. They're going to step outside of their comfort zones, for some people, way outside of their comfort zones, to share a little bit about themselves, be a bit vulnerable, and to tell the stories that matter most to them. You're going to hear about personal family stories, meditations on identity and self, the kind of reporting and work they've done to honor their sense of community. Hella Asian was created with this kind of sacred space in mind because stories are sacred, maybe even more so than the headlines we see in the news. And that's the kind of understanding that our partners at Comcast have. Simply put, there would be no Hella Asian without Comcast. The concept of this fundraising event was developed in partnership with them in 2018, and in the years since, Comcast has pretty much allowed us to do what we want to do, to design a live storytelling event for the community and to evolve the program. So on behalf of the AAJASF Bay Area Board, thank you, Comcast, for being our partners. There you are. And thank you for trusting our chapter's vision for the community. So this year's program is extra special because we've included AAPI chefs and vendors. Have folks been enjoying all the food and drinks? Good. I want to shout out to the chefs of Judubu, Oxen Tiger, and El Chino Grande for keeping us fed this evening, and our beverage partners, Doke Beer and Hobo Wines. These are all AAPI creators telling stories about their community in their own way. So thank you to all of them for being so generous with their time with AAJA. And reminder, right after the show, you can still eat and drink more of their beautiful creations. So let me get myself off the stage and make way for our first storytellers. I am so excited to introduce Wendy Tokuda and Maggie Tokuda-Hall. Wendy Tokuda worked as an award-winning primetime anchor in local TV news for almost 4 decades. She was one of the first Asian Americans to anchor weekday primetime newscasts in San Francisco, and she was one of the first journalists to report on the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Wendy obviously passed down her storytelling talents to her daughter, Maggie Tokuda-Hall, who will perform with her tonight. Maggie is the nationally best-selling children and young adults author of books like Also an Octopus, The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea, and significantly, Love in the Library, which is a book about her grandparents, Wendy's parents, meeting in Minidoka, an internment camp. Welcome to the stage, mother and daughter, Wendy Tokuda and Maggie Tokuda-Hall.
Okay, let me see if I can do this slide clicking thing, all right? And you'll see why anchors are never allowed to touch the technical side of things. Here it is. Okay. So Maggie's new book about her grandparents' meeting in Minidoka was the impetus for this presentation, but she comes from a very long history of storytellers. My mom was a gifted writer, and my grandmother, a storyteller before her. When my grandfather worked in a sawmill, and that's him, a friend described what my grandmother, very young at the time, was like. Your mother was so funny, and she loved to entertain me with Japanese fairy tales. She would act out the story, changing her facial expressions and voice to suit the roles. My mom said, that her friend's recollection struck her as strange because, as she said, the woman I remember as my mother was somber. Her sense of levity and joy had been worn down. My mom wanted to be an author, which was an audacious goal for a Japanese-American woman back in those days, in the 40s. But it was not an idle thought for her. She had talent, she had encouragement, particularly from one professor at the University of Washington. Oh, I forgot to show you my grandmother's picture. There she is. There's Grandma, and here is my mom, as this young woman and who wanted to be an author. She was confident enough that she actually sent some of her writing to Macmillan Publishing, and the editor wrote her back this letter, which she saved, which complimented her writing and said, I have been favorably impressed with your style. I will be glad to see the manuscript of any of your connected work. He was not as enthusiastic about her proposal for a book set in the Japanese-American community, saying, I'm just not sure this would be the time for that topic. But you write about what you know, right? Mom was a lit major in the middle of her senior year when she was evacuated. And this is my mom in the Puyallup Assembly Center, where she was first imprisoned. That's her on the right. This newspaper photo shows my dad before the evacuation, closing his drugstore when the curfew was first imposed on Japanese Americans. He would lose that store and everything in it. This was the tag my dad wore when he was taken away. And this was the notice of incomplete that the UW sent to my mother in camp. Sounds like a bad joke, but there it is. Maggie's book will tell you about my parents' meeting and when they got married in Chicago, but these were the green cards that they had to carry when they left the camp, when they were allowed to leave to find work. But my mom, actually, they were back in Chicago, actually went back to Minidoka to have their first child. A friend had told her not to have her baby in Chicago because of what happened to her in the hospital. The nurses rolled another woman into the delivery room, and the woman yelled, "Get that Jap out of here." So my mom actually elected to go back to camp to have my brother, and there they are in the middle of their barrack. After the war, my parents returned to Seattle. My dad had to borrow money to buy his own store back. They had 5 kids. That pretty much ended my mom's writing career. It's funny, but it's kind of sad too, you know? And this photo kind of sums up my folks. My dad was in charge, and my mom was tired. After my dad died, my mom kind of blossomed, as you can see here. But she started writing again. She was never widely published, though. And when she developed Alzheimer's, I had to start going through her papers, cleaning them out. And one day I found a file with envelopes that were stamped Internie of War and censored. I found journals that she had kept when she was incarcerated. This was the entry after the first night in camp. This is Puyallup here. Somebody knocked on the door at 10 p.m. Lights out, he said. At night, the searchlights go on, and it gives the grass an eerie, shiny effect. It is a prison. Last night, we couldn't sleep because a baby down the barrack cried until about 4 or 5 a.m. And Tomi, her sister, said, I want to go home. Another entry. We are a disinherited people. We are the disinherited. Letters from her friend she kept. In this one, I've been here a little over 2 weeks, but by God, it feels close to 2 years. I am already losing the sense of time. Another one. Too hot to write, too dull to think. So all these camps were in the desert. Or this letter from a friend in Idaho. Last night, the sheriff of the county and the prosecuting attorney came and said that 150 men had threatened to come and kill us, or at least drive us out of town. They could not guarantee our safety. And then there was this document, and you won't be able to read it here, but I'm going to read it to you. This one written by the U.S. government. Hints for a successful relocation, and it was given to the colonists, as they called my parents, when they left Minidoka. And the advice included things like, don't speak Japanese in public, don't gather in large groups, don't patronize honky-tonks, bars, or other places that might reflect badly on all Japanese Americans. Try to make a favorable impression on everyone you meet. Consider yourself working to promote a better understanding of all Japanese Americans in this country. These instructions were like a blueprint for people leaving Minidoka on how to raise their children. And the message was clear to all of us. We were different. We weren't really American. I was born only 5 years after my mom walked out of those camp gates carrying my brother. And even though my parents didn't talk about it, we grew up soaked in their feelings. How could we not? We grew up in their anxiety, feeling their humiliation. They pushed us to excel in school to prove that we were good citizens. They drove us to overachieve. And that overachieving certainly had its benefits. I was able to go to college and have a successful professional career as an anchorwoman. I am, on the one hand, living proof of the promise of America. And yet, I can still feel Minidoka in my bones. I can feel the anxiety, the fear of making mistakes. I constantly feel like I am somehow in trouble. It has taken a lifetime to understand the depth of this generational trauma and to say out loud, I am the child of prisoners. Now I have children and grandchildren, and now Maggie is free to write the books that my mother was never able to.
So, hello. I've known this story, the story that would become Love in the Library, for all my life. I don't remember the first time someone told me how my grandparents met, nor do I recall the singular moment when I realized for the first time that the United States enacts racist policies. People now talk about things like epigenetic inheritances and how the incarceration of Japanese people is exactly that for their grandchildren. We inherit the sense of unease in this nation, an awareness that our acceptance here is deeply conditional. The anxiety that something like this would happen again, and once again we would be powerless to stop it. The story of my grandparents is one that has defined my understanding of what it means to be an American for as long as I can remember. And though I did not become a children's book author with the goal of writing my family's stories, 2016 changed my mind. When President Trump took office and used his absolute first opportunity with power to sign the executive order for the travel or Muslim ban, what little resolve of calm I had evaporated. As a Jew, as a Japanese American, I heard him loud and clear. He was using his power to enact the exact white supremacist agenda he had promised all along the campaign trail. And so I did all the things I knew I had to do. I protested and made calls and sent money. I signed postcards and petitions and was way too active on Twitter and was generally just doing my best to skirt a nervous breakdown on a daily basis. I also evaluated what I could potentially offer in such terrible times. And I realized our family had taught me a story for just this moment about the cruelty of these kinds of policies, but also of our resilience in the face of them. And I knew I wanted to tell my grandparents' story. I began drafting the text that would become Love in the Library while protests were still happening in airports all around the United States. My agent was deeply supportive and sent it out far and wide. The responses were, initially, very lukewarm, but there was a consistency to them as well. Nicely written, they'd say, but not really right for a picture book. Would you be willing to rewrite it as a young adult novel? Or would you be willing to change the main characters to be kids who feel free when they use the library even while incarcerated? These invariably white editors felt they knew better how to tell the story of my family than I did. For the first time in my career, I dug my heels in. Typically, I pride myself on being able to take feedback, but in this case, I knew they were wrong. This story isn't too much for a small child. I knew that because I had learned it as a small child myself. Just as small children from marginalized communities must learn hard truths about America before we wish they had to, all the time. It is no secret to a Black child that the police can be dangerous. It is no shock to an Indigenous child that the U.S. government lies. These are only surprises for those privileged enough not to be directed by them directly. So I ground in. I refused. I waited until there was a publisher willing to work with me in the terms I demanded, to tell this story as it was, not as a few scattered gatekeepers thought it could have been. And in so doing, I hardened my commitment to telling our stories the way we see them, not as we are told might be more commercially viable or more curriculum friendly. I became unwilling to be used for my biography, only to have my voice tossed aside. I think of Tama and the rejection she received. Your writing is beautiful, they told her, but no one is interested in stories about Japanese people. We have long been here, ready to tell our own stories. But white supremacy demands that we tell those stories in a way that does not unite marginalized communities together in solidarity, but rather paints each of the crimes committed against us as an aberration, as separate. I go to schools often now with this book, and I give a presentation about the historical context and also about the contemporary context of racist incarceration. It's a presentation I've gotten some really bad feedback on, always from predominantly white private schools. And the number one thing I've been told not to talk about is the incarceration of Latinx children on our borders. We weren't ready for that conversation, I've been told. They're too young to learn about that. And I know they're wrong. How can I tell my grandparents' story without telling the truth? That this still happens, that this isn't over. We cannot uphold the fragile lie of white supremacy by dulling the edges of our stories. We cannot allow history to repeat itself because we were too scared of bad feedback. We cannot be afraid to tell our children the truth. They deserve better. We deserve better. And most importantly, the people who are marginalized now deserve better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wendy and Maggie, for helping us learn about an important chapter. Family histories also help us preserve our histories, so thank you so much. Our next performer also knows a lot about the importance of preserving critical community history. Barnali Ghosh is the co-founder of the award-winning Berkeley South Asian Radical History Walking Tour, which shares critical narratives about local South Asian American resistant movements. Barnali is also a designer and an artist, and during the pandemic, she leaned on her creativity in a new way that she'll share with you about. Everyone, please help me welcome to the stage Barnali Ghosh.
Whew. Okay. Does it feel weird being in a room with so many people? I'm still getting used to it. So I'm going to take you on a journey, and some moments might be traumatic because I'm going to be talking about stuff that happened during the pandemic. So, for example, one day, a few months into the pandemic, I woke up like this. Well, not exactly. A few months into quarantine, I heard about the social media challenge called the Getty Museum Challenge. And folks were being asked to recreate famous artworks using things they had lying around the house. But I was really intrigued by it, but I didn't want to do the old masters. I wanted to recreate artworks by South Asian, Asian, and women artists. I wanted to recreate art found outside museums, art that's often marginalized in Western discourse. Over the course of the year, I would do over 50 art recreations. And they became, for me, kind of a pandemic diary. I used them to deal with pandemic themes like the struggle to keep our homes sanitized. I did a shout out to my parent friends who suddenly found themselves to be the sole caregivers of their children. I side-eyed folks who were not wearing masks. And I tried to express the anxiety of essential workers stepping out into our cities. I used them to capture all the pandemic blues of being stuck at home, of being exhausted, of missing friends. Those are all the lamps in our house. I used them to respond to events that took on significance even during a pandemic. I mourned the loss of the women in Atlanta who were lost to anti-Asian hate. I felt inspired by the renewed movement for Black lives after the death of George Floyd. And I tried to express the familiar pain of being an immigrant far from home when Kolkata was hit by a cyclone. Through all of this, my body, my face were at the center of my art. I painted it, I taped it, I put it in all kinds of awkward positions. I attempted a nude. I only just put some almost gone bananas to good use. I mean, by now, you know that baking was not one of the things I picked up during the pandemic, because then these would be banana bread instead. I mean, I did do a couple of pieces featuring baked goods, like this one with my dance friends Maureen and Girija, featuring that beautiful sourdough, courtesy my friend Maureen. But mostly, I was putting toilet paper rolls on my head, or contorting my body into awkward positions, risky positions that my husband Anirvan then had to photograph. Look, growing up as a girl in India, you were not taught to center your body. You're taught to hide it. Years of street sexual harassment or comments from family members telling me that I was overweight or dark, or that my hair was not long enough or thick enough. All of that had me hiding under layers of insecurity, layers of clothing. I did not want to draw any more attention to this body. And if I wasn't feeling bad enough about my body already, a decade ago, I developed fibroids. And over the Trump years and the pandemic, they grew to a size that even clothing couldn't hide. And I started being asked that dreaded question more frequently. That dreaded question, are you pregnant? So I had to do a recreation to let folks know how I felt about being asked that question. This one is inspired by my friend Pallavi, who taught me that it's never okay to ask the question. Anyway, suddenly I couldn't just walk around without thinking about what recreation I would do. Remember the day of the orange sky? I woke up and I did Hopper's Morning Sun. And then later that year, when I had to get major surgery to remove my fibroids, the very next day in the hospital, I did American Gothic. This should tell you a little bit about where my head was during the pandemic. So, on the day that I got my vaccine, I was so happy, I was so hopeful. This was going to change everything. But all I could think about was, what recreation am I going to do to mark this moment? So, as soon as I got home, I had this idea, and I put on the outfit that I planned in my head, and I set up my tripod. I put my iPhone on it. I set the 10-second timer, and I struck a pose. Is it 10 seconds yet? Is it? Turn it and move too quickly. Set another timer, 10 seconds. It was a hot April day, and I ran back and forth 10, 20, maybe 30 times before I got the pose that I wanted to help me recreate the California poppy, our gorgeous state flower. I was feeling really bold that day, so I posted this photo to the California Native Plant Society Facebook group, where I had lurked. Some of you are already laughing because, I lurked there for years. They have very strict moderation, and I waited anxiously, wondering if these admins would approve this photo of a brown immigrant woman cosplaying a native wildflower. But then they did, and the reaction was huge. Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments. People were really excited about this image. So then it turned out to be California Native Plant Week, so I decided to do one a day. I did the lupin, whose petals turned from purple to pink when pollinated. I did these really sweet baby blue eyes that I found down the street from our house. I did the funny fried egg flower, the Matiliha poppy, and this gorgeous California peony that many folks are surprised even exists. And I loved capturing the complexity of the patterns of the wild iris. And that's how I got started on my current series of self-portraits, where I recreate California native flowers using fabrics from South Asia and with poses inspired by Odissi dance. Now, many of the saris that I use in these photos, they've sat in suitcases for years. Some of them are from the time of my wedding. Some are gifts that I've received over the years. And the most precious of them are saris that were handed down to me as memories of a loved one who has been lost. For me, the draping of the sari and then being able to create the bloom, but then being able to put it away, is like the blooming of our wildflowers, who grace us with our presence for just a moment in time. I used the first sari I ever bought to create this globe lily. I tried to capture its pinks and greens, its fuzzy white inside. This photo of the globe lily was taken by Amy Patton, who's a photographer with the California Native Plant Society, who I connected with over Instagram through this project. She also took this beautiful photo of the fairy slipper orchid. I used a sari that was given to my mother at her wedding to capture the delicate pink of our wild rose. And another sari that was given to my mom-in-law by her father to capture all of the feelings that were evoked in me when I first saw the bleeding heart. Now, when I moved to this country over 2 decades ago, I came here to train to be a landscape architect. And when I was taught about California plants, professors, ecologists, they would often use words like native to describe plants that were here prior to European contact. But they also use words like exotic, invasive to describe everything else. And I get that, when you're analyzing ecosystems, these distinctions might be important. But to me as an immigrant, these words made me really uncomfortable because they seemed violent, they seemed nativist. So even when I understood the importance of native plants to our biodiversity and the health of our ecosystems, it felt othering. Now, more recently, it feels like the community has been using language that's more specific, less othering. But these old words and metaphors, they're powerful. And that's why I want to mess with them. Posing in a sari, posting a photo, means you could be called exotic. But what does it mean if you're depicting a flower from a deeply indigenous ecosystem? Now, these pieces, they are meant to delight, but there are hidden layers below. When I look at this image, I see at least 4 things that were forever altered by historic colonialism: the handloom weaving of saris, Odissi dance, California's indigenous landscapes, and the way my body is perceived in this country. For me, I'm trying to make these connections between 300 years of coming from a colonized homeland and my journey here as an immigrant. The choices I made, the global structures I don't control that have me now living in Berkeley, California. How do we allow ourselves to bloom where we're planted? What does it feel like to be rooted in a place? What does it do to your relationship with that place? For me, it allowed me to become part of a campaign to de-police traffic enforcement in Berkeley. This was right after the death of George Floyd. This was a campaign that received national attention. It inspired me to become a lead organizer on a campaign to rename a downtown Berkeley street after Kala Bagai. Kala was one of a handful of South Asian women who came to the US over 100 years ago. She survived housing discrimination in Berkeley and the death of her husband due to racist immigration laws. For me personally, this project continues to help me learn about native flowers and build my own relationship with them. Even now, when I smell jasmine, it transports me to the homeland. I want to be able to walk around, see these indigenous flowers, and feel like I'm at home. The bloom of the California poppy is resplendent. But the bloom is just half the story. It's its ability to put down roots that helps it survive, even in inhospitable conditions. When I started doing these recreations, I did not know that it would set me on a journey of love and acceptance, that it would provide a light on the darkest days of the pandemic, that it would introduce me to so many special flowers. I did not know that it would help me find the cracks in the concrete, help me put down roots and bloom. Thank you.
Wasn't that so good? Let's give it up for Barnali one more time. Putting a lot of us to shame because I only wore sweatpants during the pandemic. I am so excited about this next performer. JP Dobrin is a freelance documentary filmmaker and a portrait photographer who has reported on a range of different topics, including wealth inequality, criminal justice, and immigration. Those last two topics are spotlighted in his recent documentary, The Lookout, which is about Southeast Asian deportations, which you'll hear more about in just a little bit. The early production of this documentary project was supported by a really special program from our chapter, our AAJ chapter. It's called Rising with the Tides. That project was conceived in 2020 in partnership with Comcast. In that first year of the pandemic, of course, our planning for Hella Asian was halted, but Comcast didn't want to interrupt their support of AAJA. So they rerouted funds that were allotted for Hella Asian towards Rising with the Tides to help AAPI journalists continue telling stories and get paid during a time when there were a lot of layoffs and uncertainty. It was conceived as a kind of emergency story funds program where journalists could get their work funded by grants from Comcast. The early version of JP's documentary was a recipient of a Rising with the Tides story grant. Everyone, please give it up for my friend, JP Dobrin.
So I picked up and said hello, and there was a lady on the other end, and she said, this is such and such facility, ICE facility, and we heard that you are paroling tomorrow, and I said, yes, I am paroling tomorrow. Go, yeah, that's good, we're happy for you, but we want to let you know that we will be picking you up tomorrow. But right then, my heart just dropped. That was the heartfelt moment, like, okay, all my plans that I had on being paroled in the United States just went down the drain. And then I had to start from scratch again.
Hey, everybody. That was Jimmy, who lived in Long Beach, California, and was deported to Cambodia after serving his prison sentence. I've made documentaries around immigration issues, from Venezuelans leaving their country in South America to DACA recipients in Oakland opening up a food truck. But I wanted to find contemporary stories about Asian American immigration, since most of the stories I kept hearing about focused on Latinx issues. And I kept hearing about deportations happening right here in the Bay Area, from organizations like the Asian Law Caucus and the Asian Prisoner Support Committee. I thought that this would be a story that I would be well suited to tell, as I've always identified as being Asian American while growing up in California, which is a complex label that can be comforting at times when I'm with people that look like me. But the other times it can be pretty annoying to have my Korean identity glossed over, which I think a lot of us have experienced before. When all Asians are lumped together. As I spent more time reporting this story, I found myself struggling with this very same trope and kind of even falling into it myself, identifying with the participants while simultaneously seeing the differences of my own experience. Immigrants and refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia that came here during the 1970s and 1980s had their own unique set of circumstances. And some of their kids faced different challenges than other Asian American youth, especially my own. Here's a brief recap for those who don't know. During the Vietnam War, President Richard Nixon ordered a secret bombing campaign in Cambodia and Laos. Then a US ally orchestrated a coup in 1970. The Khmer Rouge gained influence after this and created the genocide in Cambodia as we know it, if you've heard of the killing fields. Many Cambodians fled to the borders of neighboring countries like Thailand. A number of people I interviewed were born in those very same refugee camps. Here's a clip explaining the circumstances they faced when adjusting to the United States.
In a lot of ways, things for the Southeast Asian community have been really bad when it comes to incarceration for decades. And Southeast Asian youth sort of fell into this perfect storm. A lot of them were born in refugee camps during the war. They came to the US in the early 80s. And in the late 80s, early 90s, right when they were hitting their teens, the entire country was in this state of fear about crime.
They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about
predators on our streets. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society.
It's a while back for Biden right there. Chanthan Bun was one individual I interviewed that was caught up in the storm. When he was adapting to American life, he told me how other kids would pick on him and his friends and family because of the flip-flops they wore around the neighborhood. Not every immigrant can keep their head down and work hard until they achieve the American dream. The pull yourself up by your bootstraps motto doesn't work for everyone, especially if you're wearing flip-flops and sandals. A common theme I heard during my reporting was the early Asian hate they endured. This was long before COVID or the hashtag. Their family and friends were terrorized because they were the newcomers. They didn't speak a lot of English, sometimes were physically smaller, thought to keep large amounts of cash at home, or too scared to report crimes to police. Here's a clip of Bun explaining some of his circumstances and experiences when he first arrived in Los Angeles.
When we came here with nothing, so we started with nothing. We moved to a poor part of LA right by Dodger Stadium, and I started school. It was hard. We were on welfare, Medicare. In the 80s, 90s, it was dangerous for a teenager, especially a person of color, the neighborhood we lived in. It was a war zone. I was illiterate, I couldn't find a job. I have a kid and another one on the way. And all I knew was the street life. When I was arrested, I was like, okay, I'm a lookout. I'll probably end up doing no more than 5 years. All of a sudden, it's like, you're facing almost 50 years. I was like, what? I don't understand what you're telling me. And nobody was physically harmed. They just threw my life away.
So that piece and the collection of clips I'm showing you were just broadcast on PBS last week if you want to see the whole film. When I started this project, I was unsure if the audience would be able to sympathize with a felon who had committed murder, robbery, or drug trafficking. I wasn't sure, and I'm still not sure if I could forgive a perpetrator if I was on the receiving end. But slowly hearing a combination of different stories, hearing these personal experiences, hearing Bun's experience and other formerly incarcerated folks, started to change my thinking. And as you could see, unfortunately, the timing of the 1990s tough on crime era, the gang labels that were inherently racist, that enhanced sentences, created this perfect storm. Bun received an additional 30 plus years after receiving gun and gang enhancements on top of the armed robbery sentence. And most of the men I spoke to went into prison in their late teens and lost out on decades of their youth. This stat from a recent BuzzFeed article came out in May of 2022. From 1977 to 1997, a period when Asian population in the US tripled, arrests of Asian American and Pacific Islander youth increased over 700%. Throughout my various interviews with formerly incarcerated Asian folks, I was always impressed by the emotional maturity I heard, the wisdom they had, their mental health experience, and how much of a waste it would be to throw that away by deporting them after spending hundreds of thousands of dollars rehabilitating them in prisons. If you didn't know, California spends over $100,000 per year per inmate. Compare that to Stanford University's tuition for housing and tuition here in the Bay Area. There's lasting damage to families and communities when an important figure is removed due to incarceration. Immigrant families face this trauma twice because their loved one can be incarcerated again in federal prison and deported by ICE, despite serving their sentences like every other American. And many of these child refugees haven't ever lived in Cambodia. They were born in refugee camps in Thailand as their parents were fleeing from the Khmer Rouge. But because ICE in our system doesn't know where to put them, they'll just choose to send them back to where they think their parents are from. Here are clips of 3 individuals who were caught up in that incarceration and immigration system. The first is Chantan Bun again, who reunites with his mom after 23 years.
Ôi, cô này cô. Bà sợ. Cô này cô ở vì ngày này tầm cửa chung mặt mà rong chồng phương luôn. Đi tao tăng vì tú nhỉ. Mama. Ôi, thôi giờ tay.
As you can see, this is home for me now. I'm stuck here. Gotta make the best of it. So, I miss my friends, miss my family. This is life I have to look forward to. It's freedom.
So that last clip was Jimmy, who we started out with. He's been out in Cambodia. He's currently working as a teacher and started a new family there. The gentleman and his son, Sok Leun, reunited with his family after he was wrongly targeted for deportation for trafficking marijuana across state lines. Chantan Bun is now a community advocate at the Asian Law Caucus and helping push forward new legislation in California called the Vision Act, which would stop California prisons directly cooperating with federal immigration officials to deport inmates before they get a chance to step outside state prison. Bun will be targeted for deportation proceedings unless he gets a pardon from the California governor. And this is an ongoing issue playing out today. I feel uncomfortable presenting this story because I'm representing a community that's different than my own. I learned why I'm not the best person to tell the story over the course of working on it, but I became friends with many of the people who I spent time with and cared about the issues they were facing. So I'm an ally now. If Bun's here, can you stand up, Bun? You still here, Bun? Stay standing, stay standing. You're in the dark. Thank you guys so much, appreciate it.
also for Bun. Those reunion videos get me every time. It's such important perspective of the Asian American community that just doesn't get told enough. So thank you, JP, and thank you, Bun. My next guest is Ericka Cruz-Gevarra, who's a familiar face here at KQED, or actually she's a familiar voice. She's the host and producer of KQED's local news podcast, The Bay. She's done incredible work highlighting Bay Area stories that often go unseen, including spotlighting her hometown of Vallejo. She's worked at NPR's Code Switch, Oregon Public Broadcasting in Portland, and she's an alumna of NPR's Next Generation radio program. Everyone give it up for Ericka Cruz-Gevarra, better known as ECG.
So back in the MySpace days, I was really into cameras and taking pictures of things. Taking pictures was a very casual hobby of mine in high school. I would bring a digital camera to family events and just document them. And my best friend, Rochelle, she's always been into cameras and taking pictures of things too. Now, a little bit about Rochelle. Rochelle and I have this matching tattoo on our arms of our childhood homes. We grew up on the same street in Suisun City, California, in one of those suburbs where every other fourth home is the same model. Our childhood homes were identical, inside and out. My favorite addendum to this fact is that we even had the same couch twice. We're also both Filipina American, so we've always had a lot to relate on, and photography was just another one of those things. Me and Rochelle have been friends for more than 20 years now, and when the pandemic hit in 2020, we didn't really see each other at all. So when the vaccine finally arrived and promised to change life in the pandemic, we got vaxxed up as soon as we could and planned a camping trip. Now, it was March of 2021 by this point, and I forgot what it was like to plan things, and this trip was all kind of happening a little last minute, but we landed on a place that we both had never been before, Kirby Cove in the Marin Headlands. We pulled up their reservation page, and there was one available evening for late March at campsite number 1, and so we booked it. Even as adults, Rochelle and I still both love photography, so it's not a surprise that we both brought our film cameras on the trip. And this was my first big trip out of the house since the start of the pandemic. As a journalist, I needed a break from the news. Rochelle needed a break from her job as a coordinator for an after-school program, which she had been running via Zoom. We hadn't really had quality time with each other in months. We both needed this. And then Atlanta happened.
We want to start with a horrific shooting rampage in Georgia that has left 8 people dead.
We're learning some new details about a string of shootings at Atlanta area spas that left 8 people
deadly shootings in Atlanta, killing at least 8 as well. Fearing the attacks may have targeted the Asian community.
A series of deadly shootings at Asian massage parlors.
6 of the 8 dead are said to be Asian women.
6 were women of Asian descent.
Police say the 21-year-old suspect admitted to the shooting, saying he blames the spas for providing an outlet for his addiction to sex. Police also say he was heading to Florida, intending to...
By this point, I had seen dozens of stories and photos and videos of Asian elders being beaten and attacked. Oakland and San Francisco were the epicenters of some of the most high-profile incidents. As a producer working in local daily news, it was my job to pay attention to these things. To let them swirl in my mind and figure out how to cover them. And no matter how much I wanted to, I could not look away because I felt that it was my responsibility and my job to bear witness. Now, when I told my dad about me and Rochelle's camping trip, I remember him telling me, if you don't go out, nothing bad will ever happen to you. If the 6 Asian women and 2 customers killed in Atlanta never left their homes, then sure, they might not have been killed by an armed white gunman who targeted Asian businesses because of his, quote, sex addiction. Sometimes when I go out, I worry that my dad will prove me right. But as journalists, we're not really supposed to have big feelings about the stories that we work on. To cover the pain of the pandemic, the failures of our institutions, police violence, attacks on the Asian community, all the while meeting our deadlines. Compartmentalizing is a necessary skill. So I spent the week of the Atlanta shooting shoving my feelings to the back of my mind just to get through work. And by the end of the week, I was just happy to be getting away. I packed my car for one night of camping with my best friend. Now, Kirby Cove is this amazing grove of cypress and eucalyptus and pine with its own private little beach. One of the descriptions of Kirby Cove on the official Golden Gate Park's National Conservancy website says, quote, "No beach in the world has a view like this." Now, to get to our campsite, you have to walk from one end of the cove to the other. Campsite number 1 was the furthest from the entrance, perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean with San Francisco on the other side. It was the best campsite on the cove. And we felt lucky because for most of the day that we arrived, we were the only ones there. Me and Rochelle pitched our tent and began exploring the cove. Around the corner from our campsite was Battery Kirby. It's this large slab of concrete built into the hillside and was used to defend the coasts during wartime. Before the end of World War II, batteries like these contained 16-inch guns that fired 2,000-pound projectiles. At Battery Kirby, visitors had covered these abandoned structures in chalk drawings and messages. Me and Rochelle picked up some chalk off the ground and left our own notes. I wrote "Stop AAPI Hate" with the Atlanta shooting and all these attacks on Asian people in mind. Rochelle wrote "Love us like you love our food." I didn't think about it at the time, but there was so much irony in that act. Yet another example of gun violence in America, commemorated on a slab of concrete that once housed weapons of war and domination. We made our way down to the beach and touched the water. I marveled at the cliff's walls. There were these amazing indents in the earth that looked like stairs. The roots of the trees that shaded our tent above were poking out, and it was such a beautiful day. As the sun began to set, we walked back through the cove to the entrance where our car was and brought the remainder of our things to our campsite. More campers had begun showing up and pitching up their tents around the cove. I started to take stock of who else was camping at the cove that night. One campsite was a group of white high school boys with their one Asian friend. At another site was a group of men drinking beers who gave off bachelor party in the wilderness vibes. I couldn't help but notice that there weren't any other women around, or any other people of color for that matter, with the exception of the Asian kid. And I started to become painfully aware of my body. Now, to get anywhere to and from Rochelle and I's campsite, we have to pass Battery Kirby and our large chalk messages written in huge letters. But I couldn't bear to look at it. Every time we passed by it, there was this dread that I could not shake. Something inside of me was deeply paranoid. I worried that we would find it defaced, either with some sort of hateful message or maybe even a Nazi symbol. Something to tell me that someone who doesn't agree with stopping Asian hate would be here. Something to prove that maybe my dad was right, that I should have just stayed home. And whether these fears were legitimate or not, I started to regret what we had written on the battery walls. Writing those messages had woken something up in me. They were reminders of the thoughts and the feelings that I had spent the week shoving to the back of my mind. In the wilderness, your sense of safety is warped when you're a woman. And when you're out of the house, period, in March of 2021, your sense of safety as an Asian person is warped too. I kept these thoughts to myself, though. I tried over and over to ignore them. And by this point, the sun had set and the city was glowing, and the other side of our campsite was pitch black. Before the trip, I'd printed out the New York Times' 36 questions that lead to love. Me and Rochelle had planned to do this activity together after dinner. And according to the preamble to the questions, the idea is that mutual vulnerability fosters closeness. And I learned things about Rochelle that I didn't know before. I learned, for example, that she has a secret hunch about how she'll die, that she thinks I'm a generous person. We talked about facts about our lives that we forgot were actually wild coincidences, like the fact that our dads are from the same town in the Philippines, that they both had 3 daughters, and that we were both the bunsos, or the youngest, and how wild it was that the universe had brought their daughters together on that cliff at that moment. We talked about her mom's death when we were just freshmen in high school, and how I didn't always know how to be helpful after that, and that for her, this trip represented healing. It was the kind of conversation with your best friend that grounds you, brings you back to earth. The kind of conversation that feels like another chapter for 2 friends just growing up and figuring out how to do life together. Now, I only mentioned my fear and paranoia to Rochelle once that night. She asked me if it was because of the people that we passed on the way back to the campsite. She knew. She sounded so sure when she said that we were going to be okay, and that comforted me. But I did not sleep at all that night. Instead, I gamed out an escape from our spot on the cliff in case someone tried to enter our tent. I even imagined waking up to a group of white men lounging in our chairs and helping themselves to all of our food. Every rustle in the leaves made my heart stop. Rochelle's brother-in-law had slipped a knife in her bag just in case, but we accidentally left it inside of the lockbox that secures our food from wild animals, and it was dozens of feet away from our tent. I tried to focus on the sound of the ocean, and I probably slept a total of 3 hours that night. When we woke up the next morning, our mural was untouched. The group of high school boys and the bachelor party in the wilderness were all gone by 8 a.m., and we were alone again. Me and Rochelle ate ramen for breakfast and took in the final hours of the most amazing view of the Golden Gate Bridge before it was time to pack up and go home. A week later, I processed our camping trip in therapy. I told my therapist that I had never felt so out of control over my own mind and body. She told me that what I experienced was a trauma response, a direct result of my job as a journalist, and likely a culmination of all the information that I was consuming about the shooting in Atlanta and the attacks on Asian people leading up to it. It was the first time that I really allowed myself to cry about what had happened in Atlanta. In journalism school, you don't really learn about the psychological impact of this work or how to mitigate it. And when it's your community under attack, how do you stop yourself from having big feelings about the story? How do you compartmentalize that? For Black, Native, Latinx, and Asian journalists, we're expected to do this every day under the guise of objectivity, when what we really mean to say is the guise of whiteness. After the Atlanta shooting, Asian journalists reported being told by their superiors that they weren't allowed to cover the story for fear that Asian reporters couldn't cover it fairly. By telling journalists of color to remove ourselves from stories, it's asking us to whitewash them, when in reality, our experiences, our hurt, our pain, and our fear only illuminate the truth. It wasn't until weeks later that me and Rochelle developed our film from the trip, and when I got the photos back, I was floored. How is it that all I could see is joy? I wondered if my smiles were evidence of a sort of dissonance, or maybe of how good I'd gotten at compartmentalizing. But I think many things can be true at once, and I'm glad that this is what I have to remember of our trip, because they also show me that we can make art out of tragedy and pain, that when I'm afraid, fear insists that I return home to my body, and that maybe this is what it looks like to return to my body, if even for a photo. These photos remind me that it's our friends, our family, our community who will always beckon us home, and that it's them who will remind us to smile for the camera, to remember joy. Thank you.
Everyone, give it up for ECG again. Can't think of a better person to capture the complexity of being an Asian American woman and a journalist at this time. I was holding it together back there. So much of that resonated with me. Our next speaker, Sonia Paul, is also a Comcast Rising with the Tide Story grantee. She also serves as one of the at-large board members of our AAJ local chapter. She's an Oakland-based journalist, writer, and producer, and also a teacher and editor at Uncuffed, an audio training program in California prisons. Sonia's story that you'll hear about was funded by Comcast in 2020 and was published in Wired magazine. It spotlights a side of Silicon Valley that you likely haven't heard about before. Everyone, please welcome Sonia Paul.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. So I'm going to tell you a story about how I came to report this story. Trapped in Silicon Valley's hidden caste system. It published online this past March and was featured in the April issue of Wired magazine. I'm guessing most of you here might have at least a vague understanding of the caste system, especially with the release of the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. The caste system is sometimes used as a way to talk about race in the United States. But it has its own history and trajectory in South Asia and the diaspora. It's an ancient Hindu hierarchical system that ranked people along the basis of purity and pollution. The higher you are, the purer you are. And the people at the lowest rung of the caste system, so low they're technically outside the caste system, were considered so impure that they were untouchable. Hence the so-called name, untouchable. But I say untouchable in quotes because while it's a term most people are familiar with, it's not the term most people in this community would use for themselves. Sometimes, if they've converted out of Hinduism to escape the caste system, which many of them have, they might instead just refer to themselves by their new religions, say Christian or Buddhist. Oftentimes, they might also call themselves Dalit, which means broken or crushed in Sanskrit. Many Dalits have made enormous strides to improve their lives. At the same time, caste prejudice, gender violence, discrimination, and other atrocities persist. And as caste has spread beyond Hinduism into other religions and throughout South Asia, it has also spread into the diaspora. If you follow tech news, you might have even heard about a recent situation about caste at Google. A prominent anti-caste activist was barred from giving a talk about caste after Google determined the conversation, which hadn't even happened yet, was creating too much division and rancor among its employees. News about that broke at the beginning of this month. But what really seemed to ricochet an interest in caste in the US was a lawsuit that came forward back in the summer of 2020. It alleged that caste discrimination had taken place at Cisco, a tech company headquartered right here in San Jose. So this is all fairly recent, but caste is something that's driven much of my reporting for years. It started back in 2013 when I was a baby journalist freelancing in India. Caste would inevitably come up in my reporting. For example, with this story. India's first gay marriage ad turns into a new battle over caste. The story is exactly what the headline says it's about. A mother of a well-known gay rights activist had posted a marriage ad for her unmarried son in an Indian tabloid. At the end of it read, "Caste no bar, though ire preferred." So marriage ads like this are pretty common in India, and lots of people praised the ad, this Indian mom trying to find a partner for her gay son. Yet at the same time, it attracted criticism for challenging one type of discrimination, yet seeming to wink at another. Because why even mention caste? Iyer is a last name, a caste name, for a community of Tamil Brahmins. Brahmins being the most privileged caste. So let's step aside for a minute. Imagine putting your racial preferences on a dating app profile. Clarifying you don't really have a racial preference, but white people are preferred, and you happen to be a white person yourself. That is the kind of territory we're in here with this ad, which, again, is socially acceptable among many South Asians. And however you feel about that, this ad does demonstrate how caste perpetuates, which is by people marrying within their own caste. That's actually the case in my own family, although you wouldn't think about this at first glance. My mom's side is Indian and Filipino, and she and her brothers were all born and raised Catholic in the Philippines. They were also part of the Sikh community there. Her father, my grandfather, helped establish the first Gurdwara in the Philippines. My dad, meanwhile, was raised in a Hindu family that also sometimes prayed in a Gurdwara and worshipped a Sufi saint in their home state of Punjab. They married in 1971, when mixed marriages were far less common than they are now. And they had an arranged marriage. Now, arranged marriages are common enough among South Asians, but as I saw it, they usually seem to take place for people who had more in common than my parents did. But when I started asking deeper questions about how this particular arrangement between these two different people from two different countries and different faith backgrounds came about, the answers led to caste. Because when my grandfather started looking for someone for my mom, he looked within their own community. And I'm saying community in quotes because this word, as well as a word like culture, inevitably become euphemisms for what is actually in practice, which is caste. My family comes from a caste that had economic advantage, in part because we didn't come from a disadvantaged caste community. And that's the truth for the majority of Indian Americans in the US. They're a narrow slice of the Indian population and have both class and caste privilege. So taking a step back, as soon as I started realizing all of this, I started to think more and more about what we really mean when we say the word minority, and what it means to be a minority within a minority. Growing up, I thought about this primarily when thinking about my family compared to other Indians and other Filipinos. But now I was thinking about minorities within those two cultures, and how we even know what we know about our own family and community histories. Where do we get our constructs for what is, say, an Indian identity, or a Filipino identity, or an Asian identity? How often are we actually relying on a singular perspective to frame an entire community? Because when you bring caste into the picture, every caste is technically a minority within a broader system. But even in that system, there's still a dominant, privileged population. So you can imagine why, coming back to the Bay Area after freelancing in India, with all these thoughts and ideas in my mind, I was attracted to covering caste. Solidarity movements between Dalits and Black Lives Matter activists were starting to pop up, as well as a huge debate among some South Asians and Hindus in California about the representation of ancient Indian history in school textbooks. And that included the representation of caste. As I started reporting those stories, deeper questions propelled me. Why has caste been so invisibilized in the diaspora? And why are so many people so cagey to talk about it? But here's the thing. Even the framing of that question reflects a caste perspective. Because caste is only invisible for those who have had the privilege not to see it. When I talked to Yeshika Dutt, who's a Dalit journalist and the author of the memoir Coming Out as Dalit, here's what she had to say.
So a swath of the population in the US of Indian Americans looks like upper caste and upper class, and they're very happy to hide this grim reality of what the society really is. They're very happy to not talk about it, and they're very happy to call it culture.
Yeah, I mean, why do you think it's become known as culture?
Well, it's the same way that misogyny in Indian American communities is called culture. It's the same way that anything that has to do with taking away the power of women is called as culture. It's because it's convenient. It's because it's the way things are done back home. And somehow, instead of processing and unpacking that, we just bring it here and we just keep it, under our beds, and we just allow it to grow, and we say, don't touch that. That's my culture.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's that people are hiding it, or that people don't know that it is caste?
It goes both ways, right? I mean, you have to hide something for someone to not know.
I did that interview with Ericka back in 2019. So in June of 2020, when I was sitting on my couch one night, laptop on my lap, scrolling through Twitter, as one does, and I saw a headline from Reuters about a lawsuit alleging caste discrimination at Cisco, my eyes nearly bugged out. What people had been hiding, as Jessica put it, was coming out in the open and raising questions about what kinds of discrimination we're going to recognize, and I mean legally recognize, in this country, and whose voices we're going to pay attention to make that decision. So I applied for the Rising with the Tides grant from AAJASF to pursue a story related to this, which became the story for Wired that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. But any journalist who reports on caste will tell you it's hard to find Dalits willing to put their names out there. And since caste isn't always obvious and relies on navigating an almost secret code, some Dalits choose to actively hide that part of themselves, to avoid whatever harm or prejudice they might encounter and not put everything they've worked toward, including these sometimes high-profile tech jobs, at stake. Which means that so many of them, as minorities within a minority here in the US, can also, in fact, pass for being from a more privileged caste. When I started talking to my editor, Sandra Upson, about what I thought were hurdles to my reporting, she gave me incredibly wise advice. That maybe I should lean into these tensions, and that doing so would bring out a deeper story. That's how I ended up reporting on the person I profiled, who goes by the name of Siddhant. He had never before shared his life story with anyone, but over the year and a half that we worked together, he became much more comfortable with expressing himself. And it's really a shame, because we were supposed to have done this talk together. Even though I'm a journalist who reports on caste, this isn't my story. I'm not the face of caste discrimination. I'm telling you who I am in relation to my reporting so you have some context. The people you should really prioritize listening to when it comes to caste are Dalits. Siddhant wasn't comfortable revealing his identity in the Wired story, but after it got positive attention, he seemed confident about being here. But then what happened? Well, like I said, there was huge news at Google about the company canceling a talk on caste discrimination. Lots of people were upset. At the same time, lots of people were pleased. And it's because of those voices who don't want to talk about caste, and some who are outright denying that caste discrimination exists, that Siddhant wavered, and then ultimately backed out of being on stage. For him, the current environment doesn't seem safe to come out in public. So this is not quite a happy ending to this story, but I hope this gives you some perspective about the stakes surrounding caste and why so many people are trying to make caste more visible. It's so Dalits can also feel safe to make themselves visible too. And if anything I've said here has piqued your interest and you want to know more, good. Tonight is a night where many of us are here celebrating where we come from. But let's also not forget who's not here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia. So I know on our program it says that we are at the second to last performance, but this will actually be the last performance of tonight. Michelle Mushley had a family emergency to tend to. She sends her love. But I'm so excited for our last and next speaker, Richard Louie. He is no stranger to being in the spotlight. You might recognize him. He's been a news anchor at NBC News and MSNBC since 2010. Previously, he was at CNN Worldwide. In 2021, he published his first book, Enough About Me, which focused on the unexpected power of selflessness. It spotlighted an issue that may resonate with many of you, caregiving for your elderly parents. He's going to share a bit about that experience with you now. Everyone, please give it up for Richard Louie.
Hello, Asian. How are we doing? Yeah? Woo! Such an amazing day. I'm so glad all of you decided to come down to support the narratives that all of these great storytellers shared with us today. We were watching and back and just going, wow, how powerful all of these important stories are. I want to share a story with you of how I got into this whole business thing. And I can remember that moment. I was looking out the window. I was in Atlanta, Georgia from the hotel. And you know, if you've ever been there, there's that CNN logo. And every 60 seconds, you would say CNN. And then it would go dark. And it would come back on again. So I called my dad when I was there for that interview. And I told him, you know, you're not going to guess where I am right now. I just got in from Singapore, where I was working at the time, and I told him I was staring at that blinking logo as well. I wanted him to be there. My stomach was a little uneasy, and I was just thinking what it was going to be like to be sitting at that desk at CNN, right? That desk that reached 380 million people around the world. Guess what? My room is facing that logo, and I can see the studio right below, at least the building where the studio is, Dad. Can you believe that? Well, the next day, I walked into that sprawling building. It appeared so gargantuan to me. And I watched as the two makeup artists for a moment kind of looked at each other going, how do we match this thing? His skin. And I'm pretty sure I saw one of them secretly Googling best makeup hacks for Asian males. Which surprisingly, if you've ever done that when you're bored at work, first off, don't tell anybody. But there weren't many results when it comes to that. Then they showed me the desk. There it was, and I said, Richard, please sit down. So walked over and I sat down. And the producer turns to me and says, we're going to put some stories in the teleprompter. Just start reading them. You know, they'll come up, reverse waterfall. I'm going to go into the control room where I'll be following what you're doing. You got any questions? My internal dialogue was saying, yes, how do I stop this sweating thing? Whew, man. And out loud, I instead said, do I read until I'm told to stop, right? Otherwise, I'm just going to keep on reading, right? Just don't put a question mark in there because I'll read that too. And she said, yes, stop. I'll tell you when to stop. And so that's when my screen test began. Next, the director talking in my ear goes, cue. So I had used a teleprompter for about a year by then, and so I was a little comfortable with it. And as I went along, a soundbite came up and with video. And I was just going, great, I got to take a break, yeah? A little rest off camera as, you know, the video was playing on screen. And then the producer pops into my ear and says, Richard, we got some breaking news to tell you about. A plane has crashed in Siberia. We don't have a lot of information, she told me. More nervous sweat coming up here. You know, I was like, why is she telling me this? I'm just supposed to read the prompter, right? How's I supposed to deal with that? And so I said, all right, well, I got to get this right. So I said, how many people are on board again? What was the airline? Do we know why it crashed? She got in my ear again and said, don't know the airlines. I don't remember what she was saying. She says, no cause yet. And after this video is done, you need to summarize, and then you have 45 seconds to fill. I'm going 45 seconds? That will feel like 45 years to me. If you ever tried to ad-lib in front of a camera for 45 seconds, holy Hannah. So I jotted down the details, and I hear her voice in my ear again, 20 seconds. So I was like, oh man, I grabbed one of the script pages, pressed it into my face to kind of sop up all the sweat. It looks silly, but it works if you ever have to do it, by the way. Not conventional, barely ecological, but, they're always around. And by the way, for a second, since we're all friends right now, little sidebar, why were they giving me breaking news in the middle of an audition? Is that right? Is that fair? I mean, they didn't even tell me about it. They said, just read the prompter, Richard. I mean, the analogy for that is you're asked to come in for an accounting position in an interview, and suddenly they're asking you to do high kicks to see how good your high kicks are. Well, 10 seconds, she says in my ear. So I shook my head, trying to take advantage of the off-camera time, trying to loosen up. We all do that, right? I was doing a couple clearing coughs. Some bumblebees for those of you who are singers. Bumblebee, 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 trying to, loosen up my lips. And now that I think about it, actually, that whole bumblebee exercise was like I probably sounded like a crazed man on the subway screaming out my favorite brand of tuna. But it worked. 5 seconds, she says in my ear. The soundbite finishes. And I felt ready, I thought. I'd done all those things, and she says, and cue. I turn to the camera, and I read. Now to some breaking news just into CNN. We're getting word of plane crash in Siberia approximately 1 hour ago. 130 people believed to be on that plane. We'll have more details right here on CNN when we get them for you. Now back to regular programming. All right. Okay, right? I got the breaking news story done. I thought, well, that's great. The audition finishes, and I thought, okay, pretty good. So a week later, I'm sitting with my agent on the phone, and he calls and he says, you didn't get the job. I flew all the way from Singapore for this. What did I do wrong, I asked. And, well, Richard, they don't tell you what you did wrong. They're just saying it's not the right time, right? We've all heard that before. Not the right time. What does that mean? Well, I asked, how do you think the audition went? Did I do okay? He asked me, actually, that question. And I told him, I dealt with 2 unexpected breaking news stories. I, felt nervous, but I felt like I was able to work off the stress and the sweat and got it done, right? I did my off-camera stress exercises with the bumblebees and, I was able to use paper, very entrepreneurial, right? Improvise and got the sweat off my forehead. I was proactive and innovative, I told him. And then he said, hang on a second, Richard. And then he went silent for a second. You always know that's not good. When the sound pieces play, even though you are not technically on camera, you're actually on camera. It's all part of the test. That's when actually executives are watching you the closest. And I defended myself, but I wasn't on camera. It didn't work. You're always on, he said, even if the viewer can't see you. They're watching you in terms of what's going on. The execs want to know how you can handle stress when the camera is not on. They watch what you do off camera as much as they do on. And in fact, what happens off camera might be even more important than what happens on camera, Richard. All right, so I took that to heart. 2 years later, I got the job at CNN. What I didn't know was that years later, I would figure out what really off-camera meant in life. My father got diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And I began to travel more frequently from New York to my parents' home in California, where I'd go on walks with him. And I was there to support my mother as well. I started asking how I would be able to handle my job, which is a full-time job, plus, and also my responsibilities as a son. My dad's condition was horrible for him, no doubt. It was challenging and taxing for my mother. It was awful for my siblings, and for me, it felt like a double loss. I was losing my dad in front of me, but I was also losing a job that I had fought for so long and that I thought was so difficult to get, and that also a job that my dad was so proud of that I had. As I weighed the pros and cons in my brain of leaving my career to care for my dad, I remembered the hard-learned lesson from that audition. What happens off camera is more important than what happens on camera. Growing up in a household of a minister, you can probably guess I did the opposite of what I might have been expected to do a lot. But one thing that kind of stuck out for my dad that he would often say from the pulpit was, it is more blessed to give than to receive, right? And it was now time to see if I could do that. Of course, my dad was not making an original statement. It's been made by many religions and many speakers and many leaders throughout time, right? Maya Angelou, when you get, give. Jose Marti, a Cuban philosopher, helping those in need is not only part of our duty, but of happiness. When faced with the decision that I just laid out for you, to help my dad in his slow-moving battle, life and death battle, did I believe all of these big statements that he had made and that I just mentioned? Should I deny myself and sacrifice my career and what my plans may have been to help somebody who may not even know that I'm trying to help? It's a tough question. I had two options: stay on my path of living for myself in that seat, or become a lonely family caregiver for my dad. It seemed my mind and heart were not agreeing. So I was curious, was I really alone? Was I the only person going through this? It felt like it. So putting on my journalist hat, I said, I'm going to dig in. And as part of that, I did a survey of 1,000 Americans. And when I surveyed those 1,000 Americans, this is what I found: that 73% say being selfless requires making a sacrifice. A sacrifice, meaning changing our lifestyles altogether. 73% of us believe that. But in conflict with that, 91% say being selfless can be done in small ways. Big sacrifice, small ways. Those don't match, right? They don't come together. But it showed I was not the only person, as I scratched my head, stuck with that unanswerable question that I just posed when I wanted to figure out what to do with my dad and what I wanted to do for myself. Well, why aren't we doing these small things? How come we're not doing it? There's a perception gap that selfless acts are for Mother Teresa. And people like Mother Teresa. I'm no Mother Teresa. How can I do these things? The thing is, moving the needle is sometimes not these gargantuan Mother Teresa acts. And in fact, there are these everyday things that we can do. It's doable. Now, I found how doable? You're going to ask me? It's this doable. Researchers say that we make a conscious decision about every 15 minutes. We think, okay, what am I going to do? All right, every 15 minutes we do something like that. And guess what that means? Each one of those are opportunities to think about somebody else. Instead of for ourselves, to stop and think every 15 minutes. So I took all of that to heart. I realized I could help my dad by thinking of him by making those conscious choices every 15 minutes. So, hey, Dad, I'm going to get a sandwich. He loved Subway sandwiches. And can I go and get one with you? Grab your favorite tuna fish sandwich, 6 inches. I'm ordering a new laundry basket. Maybe Mom and Dad need a new laundry basket. Let me ask them. I'm going to watch a Giants game sitting in New York. Let me call my dad, who's been a diehard fan for decades, and good choices with hats. I enjoyed it every time, every 15 minutes, more than I had thought. And to be honest, doing these non-gargantuan things turned out to be pretty gargantuan. So as the disease progressed, it turned into me traveling from New York, where I work, to San Francisco about 2 or 3 times a month. It's a long trip. And I did that travel for 6 years so that I could go and help my pops. So when my dad passed this December, I got what this meant full circle. I've had some time, I probably need more, to reflect on what he taught me, and what he said, and the way he lived every day in his own way. He was telling me something. It's what you do, Richard, off camera. That's what counts.
Thank you so much, Richard. Everyone, that concludes the 3rd annual Hella Asian. Let's give it up to our speakers one last time. There are so many people to thank to make this magical night happen. And before I get into my thank yous, I want to make a very important announcement. Our storytelling grants program that I mentioned, Rising with the Tides, is finally coming back this year. You heard 2 stories from previous grantees, JP Dobrin and Sonia Paul. This is a really important way for AAPI journalists to get their stories told and to get paid for it. And it's because of the support of Comcast and NBC Bay Area. So for all you journalists and editors in the room, stay tuned for details for on the upcoming 2022 Rising with the Tides program. We will be accepting applications soon for story pitches and for an editor for the program. Thank you, Comcast, again for your support for that and also for Hella Asian. Thank you so much. And on to my very quick thank yous. I want to shout out the rest of the AAJA-SF board, Maricar Mendoza, Harry Mock, Janelle Bicker, Sonia Paul, Kelly Huang, and all the board volunteers for lending their hands to the event. Thank you so much. And a very, very special shout out to one board member in particular, the co-chair of Hella Asian, Kristen Huang. Kristen, thank you so much for juggling all the logistics while also doing amazing reporting for Cal Matters. You're incredible. Yuji Ishikata, are you in the building? There you are over there. Yuji Ishikata, he's the man responsible for coordinating all the delicious food and drinks that you've had tonight. He's the chef of the nutrition program at JSEI, a Japanese community care and cultural organization in Emeryville. He spends each day thinking about how to nourish and care for Japanese seniors, and he's shown that same kind of love for Hella Asian. Thank you, Yuji. I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you so much. To our chefs, EJ and Hitomi from Ox and Tiger, the Judabu team, Chris Yang of El Chino Grande, thank you for the incredible food and the generosity of your time. Shout out to our drink vendors, Doke Beer and Hobo Wines. And let's also just quickly announce the raffle, the raffle prize winners. If your name is called, please give us a wave and connect with Maricar Mendoza right there in the front. The first prize is honestly one I want to steal. It's a redeemable gift certificate for a pastry box from Bake Some. If you haven't been there, it's a very popular Oakland AAPI bakery. The winner of that delicious prize is Cynthia Yao. There you are, great. Next prize is equally tasty, a Formosa chocolates gift card valued at $54. These are handcrafted bonbons created in Oakland by Kimberly Yang. We were eating these just the other night at our pre-event reception. They are really incredibly delicious, and the lucky winner is Noah Lystra. He's one of my best friends, so I didn't rig it, I swear. Lastly, we have a set of autographed books by two of our Hella Asian performers. You heard some of their stories. Richard Louie just now, his book, Enough About Me, Maggie Tokuda-Hall's Love in the Library. We also threw in an extra bonus for a little star power. There's also a signed copy of We Were Dreamers by the first Asian American Marvel superhero, Simu Liu. The raffle winner is Cad Smith. Is Cad Smith here? Okay, we'll find you, Cad, later. Thank you so much to our raffle sponsors, Bake Some, Formosa Chocolates, and our authors, Rich and Maggie. A special shout out to KQED for helping produce such an amazing event tonight. It's been incredible collaborating with this team, in particular, Ryan Davis, the executive director and superhero of KQED Live, and Yohan Martinez, KQED's senior producer of community engagement. Look out for their upcoming summer season. You can check that out at kqed.org/live. A big hello to all the beautiful people watching virtually at home, to my family. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Hi, Eileen. And that's it, folks. Thank you again so much for supporting AJA. It means the world to me and the rest of the board. And I'm going to sound like a naggy auntie, but it's for a good cause. Please go out there and eat and drink more. Don't leave here hungry or thirsty, and get home safely. Thank you so much.